marriage, family, child rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Penna Dexter.
Thank you very much for joining me, ladies and gentlemen, for today's Point of View. Sometimes I forget or neglect or wait till the very end of the program to talk about the wonderful staff we have here at Point of View. Today, a few people are out, so we have some special people filling in and doing other things, but it just reminds me of what a loyal and sort of diligent, dedicated staff we have. And, of course, Kirby Anderson's out, so I get to sit in this chair today. And he's been around for a long time and really sets the tone and makes this show what it is. But we have a fairly new producer, Steve, and I got to thank him because he's given me a plate of wonderful guests today on the program. Also, Andrew been struggling with some health issues, and he's our technical producer, board op, and Doug is sitting in for him today. Doug's been around a long time, and thank you, Doug, for being here. And then Shamila, who does the web, she's done a great job with it. And she does a lot more than the web. She does the social media and all the videos that we post and make sure that you've got everything you need as backup for all the guests we have today so you can research further. And that's all there for you at pointofview.net. So thanks to everybody. And I just wanted to say that here at the beginning because I feel like I get 2 seconds at the end of the show sometimes to say those thank yous. Today, as I mentioned, we've got a lot of guests on the program, and they're all stellar. And I hope that because we have so many, and this is my fault because I just kept on mentioning people that I wanted on, I hope I can do it all justice. But I do want to mention the lineup today. First of all, we've got Jay Richards, and he's done a lot of things. He's executive editor of The Stream, which we love here at Point of View. We often tackle the topics they put out in their articles. He is assistant research professor also at the School of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America, and he's also senior fellow at the Discovery Institute. I know him from his work in poverty, and he is the author of Money, Greed, and God, which won a Templeton Enterprise Award, and he makes a lot of common sense on that. He tackles a lot of topics. He's going to join us. It's going to be an interesting topic because here we are in the month following the month of the Reformation, a 500-year anniversary, and he's a Catholic, but he hasn't always been. And he's going to talk about sort of the unity in the body of Christ. I mean, what makes for unity in the body of Christ and what separates us and what is real Christianity? So it's going to be a little bit of a theological discussion. Then I found an interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago, and now a lot of folks are talking about it, but the mainstream media is not talking about this issue because they're scared of it. Erica Komisar wrote a book called Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters. And she's not exactly a conservative, but she's a clinical social worker, and she's been practicing for 25 years in New York. And her thesis of this book is that babies need their mom to be physically present for the first 3 years of their life. It's a biological need. And she's got the leftist female journalists, there's a big backlash. Let's just put it that way. Most of them won't even cover this issue because it threatens them so much. And I even heard today some somewhat conservative female commentators blasting it, but we're going to have her on and talk about that and see what you think about it too. And then later in the program, Steve Strang will join me. Steve Strang, many of you may know him. He is CEO of Charisma Media, and he's founder of Charisma Magazine. And he has been in the publishing field for many years. And he wrote a book, and it's so fascinating. It's called God and Donald Trump, and it chronicles the campaign and how evangelicals came around to Donald Trump and how they are now involved in the presidency, and just how did that relationship evolve? He, like me, wasn't a Trump supporter in the beginning, and for a long time, took him a while. And so he talks about that process. I know that happened to many of you. So Steve Strang will also join us, and we'll talk about that book. See what I mean when I say I've got a lot to talk about today. But I found something, we've been talking about, and a couple of days ago when I hosted, we were talking about prayer. And, of course, what happened in Sutherland Spring, Texas. And you had the whole debate about gun control that always surfaces when you have a mass shooting like this. Of course, the left demands gun control after something like this, as they are doing. The right says that shootings like this are why we need more good people carrying guns. And certainly the neighbor who came and shot Devin Kelly, shot him and chased him. He was a hero, and that probably saved lives. So that kind of makes the case that good people carrying guns is actually a positive there. But we've had in this particular tragedy, we've had people taunting those who say they're praying for the victims. We've had people criticizing members of the government. They've been criticizing Donald Trump. They've been criticizing Paul Ryan. They criticized the Congress for holding a moment of silence for the victims. And because the massacre happened in a church in Texas, this mockery has become very hot. This has been mentioned by Eric Erickson. And people are ridiculing and saying, well, where was God? Why didn't he protect these people? Why did he even allow this to happen? Your God is powerless, and things like that. So where was God when this happened? Well, he was right there. And here's a story that really shows me, and I think should show us, that he was there. There's a 5-year-old boy who was actually shot 5 times. Well, I think he was shot 5 times in the church massacre. His mother died. His 2 sisters died. And he is alive. He was shot in the stomach, the groin, and the arm. And he is in the hospital. And he seems to have turned the corner, and he's got a long road ahead. But it looks like he's going to be okay. His name is Ryland Ward. His mom, Joanne Ward, died in the shooting. His sisters, Brooke, age 5, and Emily, age 7. It's almost impossible to wrap your mind around this. This is just one of the families. None of them survived. He has another sibling, Rihanna, who did survive after a bullet ripped her glasses from her face. But he's there. He's in the hospital. He was, I think, air flighted to a hospital, and he's got an aunt. She found him in the pew. She wasn't in the church, but she got there very quickly. She found him in front in pain. She held him and comforted him until help arrived. A helicopter took him to University Hospital in San Antonio. Now there's a GoFundMe account for his care. And I would say, there was immediate prayer, of course, going out for the victims, for the families of those who were killed, for those who were hurt. And I think this is an example of an answer to prayer. And this little 5-year-old boy certainly benefited from the prayers of the people. Prayer is not always just to get things that we want. Prayer is a cooperation with God. It's being there with God, and God is with us. And there's no big promise in Christianity that we're going to have perfection and utopia in life. Bad things happen, but those are the times when we should pray. And we don't always know what God is up to. We don't know how he's working. We don't know the stories that are going to take place in the aftermath of this. It's terribly, terribly sad. And I think most of America, just like me, can hardly fathom a whole town being affected so dramatically by something. But there's just all the more reason to pray and to ask God to work his will and to extend his healing hand and to extend his grace to these people. Well, stay with us. We have so much more here on Point of View. We're going to also try to take your calls in the midst of all this, so stay with us.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Religious liberty is one of the foundations of America, and it is a right enshrined in the First Amendment. but Mary Eberstadt is concerned about the widespread discrimination in today's secular society. She explains why in her book it's dangerous to believe religious freedom and its enemies. Her book begins with the many stories that I have presented in various commentaries and that we often discuss on radio each week with Kelly Shackelford of First Liberty. Then she goes on to explain how Christians can respond to critics by holding them to standards they supposedly accept. Two examples show why Christians need to be concerned about this trend and need to learn how to respond. First, there is the sad story of Mozilla CEO Brendan Eich, who was hounded out of his position merely because he supported Proposition 8 in 2008 in California. Mary Eberstadt made the point that if someone this important and powerful could be forced out of a business, what chance do the rest of us have? The second example is Michael Lindsay, president of Gordon College in Massachusetts. He and 14 other Christians signed a letter asking for a religious exemption to the president's planned executive order banning sexual orientation discrimination by federal contractors. It's worth mentioning that even Senator Elizabeth Warren supported a religious exemption in such cases. The city of Salem suspended a long-term contract with Gordon. The Lynn School Committee ended its relationship with the college and refused to accept Gordon College students as student teachers. Then the New England Association of Schools and Colleges announced that it was going to consider whether the college violated their standards for accreditation. It is easy to see the irony. 3 centuries after the original Salem witch trials, Gordon College was subjected to a secularist witch trial. This is why Christians need to understand what is happening and take a bold stand for religious liberty. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. I am Penna Dexter. There was an election. There were a few elections across the country on Tuesday. I know that it was unpacked a bit here on Point of View yesterday. And I won't do much of that today, but I will say that, it was a setback for Republicans, especially in the state of Virginia. They were hoping that Ed Gillespie, who's a good guy, would go ahead and beat Lieutenant Governor Ralph Northam. He did not. In fact, it was kind of an overwhelming victory, and there was also some loss in the state house in Virginia. And that's being claimed as a repudiation of Donald Trump and his policies. And I think it's way too early to say something like that. I really do. And, the story has yet to be written. And we're going to talk with Steve Strang about Donald Trump a little bit later. But in the years since Donald Trump was elected president, one thing that's happened, and this is usually key in reelecting a president if it holds, and that is that the economy and the markets have been on a roll. And so, of course, Donald Trump, he's not shy, and he says, I quote, "It's because of me." And, he should probably, the Wall Street Journal said today about that, he said he should actually be giving thanks and not taking credit. This is a broader global trend. But I do think that a lot of the things that he's done, rolling back regulations, pulling us out of the Paris Climate Accords, and advocating for tax reform, which has yet to be done, has encouraged the markets and really brought a lot of optimism for the country. So in a sense, it is because of him. In a sense, he's taking too much credit, but that's just him. Is he lucky? Well, yeah, he is. He's lucky. Successful presidents, though, in some sense, do make their own luck. So some of the things he's done already have made his luck. Now, if they can't get tax reform done, don't ask. I can't even tell you what's going to happen. They have got to get it done, and they've got to get it done right. It can't be just a skinny tax reform. It's a little worrisome that the Senate is pulling back the corporate tax rate cut, or at least postponing it. That is concerning, and I just hope that they don't win that battle. But there's been, he promised 3% growth, and we've actually had 3% growth in the last 2 quarters. Now, that does not a trend make, and you have to make some systemic changes to have that continue. My commentary, which will air tomorrow during a couple of the breaks on Point of View, it will air online at pointofview.net, and you'll be able to get it also if you get our email, explains that a little bit. We have to have that corporate tax rate cut in order to really jumpstart the economy. But lighter regulation, the promise of lower taxes, and all of that has really helped. Steve Moore, though, says that the left has been very wrong about the Trump boom. Now, Steve Moore is he's with the Daily Signal. He has written for years with the Wall Street Journal. He's an economist. We've had him on this program many times. And this came out of the Daily Signal, which is a publication of the Heritage Foundation. And he says that, Time Magazine has been saying that the Trump administration is a wrecking crew, and that his cabinet is dismantling government as we know it, which is probably true. It's not a bad thing necessarily, though. It's shrinking the regulatory state. They see that as a bad thing, but it's a good thing. And last week, the stock market raced to new all-time highs. Now, we had a drop yesterday, but I think that's on the news of the Senate not going or trying to postpone the corporate tax decrease. So the stock market has been at all-time highs. We've had a good jobs report, another fall in the unemployment rate. Housing sales have soared to their highest level in a decade. But the left is blinded. They're incapable of connecting those dots, and don't expect them to do that in this debate over tax reform. But this revival of 3% growth has already defied the predictions of almost every Donald Trump critic, and I think even the hint of tax reform has been part of this growth rate. So Trump said that pro-growth policies would speed up economic growth to 3 to 4%, but some of the left is just not buying it. Jason Furman, who chaired Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, said the chances of reaching 3% growth over a decade were about 1 in 25. And another Obama economist, Alan Kruger, called that 3% growth forecast extremely rosy. Paul Krugman of the New York Times says that Trump's growth forecast is an act of economic arrogance. So this is going to be a battle between the right and the left. And I think that this is an economic issue. It's such an important issue to families, though, and the future of the nation. And if you want to see this president reelected, then the economy has to improve by the time that election comes around, and well before it. So I think it's really time now to talk to our members of the House and the Senate and encourage them to get a good tax reform plan out there and really passed before the end of the year. We can't read too much into those 2 quarters of 3% growth. We've had a booming stock market, and these are all good things, but they can reverse course quickly. We shouldn't be complacent. These are some of the points Steve Moore has been making at the Daily Signal today, and I agree. Under Obama, free enterprise and pro-business policies were basically thrown out the window. He promised a 4% growth rate. He never got, basically his average was about 2.2. Now they're saying, that's the new normal. That's as high as we can get on a sustained basis. But Trump won't buy it. So this is what the battle is. Under Obama, business investment, says Steve Moore, fell almost 2/3 below the long-term trend line thanks to higher taxes on investment. But now, partly in anticipation of this tax cut, business spending keeps climbing. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think, really it's on the line. I mean, the Congress did not pass a repeal or replacement of Obamacare. It hasn't been done. It's very, very disappointing. If they don't do something about our tax system, and it's a very hard and difficult thing to do politically, but if they don't, I think that there's not going to be a lot of hope for a Trump reelection or for the Republicans. So last night, although it is not predictive of, I think, what the trends are, the Republicans have gained so much in recent years in all the state houses across the country. it is a warning sign. It's a shot across the bow that the Republicans need to get their act together and get something done. And so, just to kind of go back to that election and those results in a sense, I think you can't read too much into Virginia. Of course, in New Jersey, it was going to be a Democrat who would win because Chris Christie had such a low approval rating, and he didn't really do a lot of the things that people were excited about at first. But Hillary Clinton did win Virginia last year. And, Eric Erickson mentioned something, too, that part of the reason Virginia votes for the liberal is because there are so many people in government living in Northern Virginia. Their jobs don't really depend on the economy. Their jobs depend on how big the government is. And so, many of those votes are going to always go to the Democrat. And so that's one reason. If President Trump had been more successful in cleaning out the government, is kind of quick to do it in 1 year. But I think as that happens, that's going to clean out some of the ranks and may change Virginia back a little bit. I lived in Virginia for 5 years, and it was a purple state then, leaning red. Now it's much more purple-blue, and that was shown this week. Progressives successfully exploited the horrible events in Charlottesville. This is coming from Gary Bauer and his update because, they basically they put up this awful ad, and I think we talked about it here on Point of View, depicting a Gillespie supporter attempting to run down minority children with his truck. They had to pull the ad down after what happened in New York City last week, down there in Lower Manhattan, with the terrorists running over people in Tribeca. But it was just disgusting. But you know what? It did play on people's emotions there in Virginia. It probably made an impact. Gary Bauer says it's probably a tactic that's going to be used again, sadly. Also, the Virginia electorate has been changing, moving further to the left. Gary Bauer points out that 40% of Northern Virginia residents are foreign-born, and a lot of times you get sort of a liberal contingent that way. So Republicans may be actually losing their grip in Virginia, and that's too bad, but it's not necessarily a trend for the whole country. We will see. I think the lesson for those of us who care about the direction of the nation is stay engaged and stay involved. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Jay Richards will join me next, but I do want to point you to the Point of View website, pointofview.net. And at the bottom, there's a banner. We are partnering with the Cradle Fund to really help displaced people, displaced by ISIS, and now because of some of the successes in rooting them out in Iraq, they are coming back to their homes, but they're coming back to devastation, and they also are experiencing just personal issues, and they need help. The Cradle Fund is there to help them, and Point of View is also there. We are partnering with the Cradle Fund, and we're asking for your help in doing that. This Sunday is the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted Church, so we all will be praying for persecuted Christians, but there are some Christian areas there in Iraq, in the Middle East. Those folks need your help right now, so we're giving you that opportunity to do it. Go to pointofview.net, and we'll be right back.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the fully animated story of the first Christmas told through a whole new set of eyes. Bo the donkey and his stable of animal friends follow the star to become some unlikely heroes.
That light, that's the star. This is where it's been leading me. What's his name?
His name is Jesus.
The Star, in theaters November 17th. More information is available at thestarmovie.com.
If you were homeless and on the run, all because you love Jesus, would you want Christians to step up and help? Our family in the Middle East, the cradle of our faith, is in desperate need because of ISIS and other persecutors. Point of View urges you to support the Cradle Fund today to help these precious believers. Please give at pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or write Cradle Fund in the memo of your check to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Penna Dexter.
Welcome back to Point of View. My next guest, as I mentioned, is Jay Richards, Ph.D., and he is a thoughtful scholar. He has such an interesting background. He's executive editor of The Stream, which The Stream provides so many thought-provoking pieces for us, and we love to interview some of the authors. He's assistant research professor also in the School of Business and Economics at the Catholic University of America. And Dr. Richards is also senior fellow at the Discovery Institute. He's written many books, some New York Times bestsellers, Infiltrated in 2013, Indivisible in 2012. And I always think of Jay Richards as someone who has really great views on how we deal with poverty in this country and economic issues. He's author of Money, God, Greed, and God, which won a 2010 Templeton Enterprise Award. He's written lots of other things. His degree, his PhD, is from Princeton Theological Seminary. And Dr. Richards, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be with you.
Well, it's good to have you. And first, I want people who are not familiar with the Stream to understand how and why you put this together, because you've got a great sort of compilation of people writing there.
We do, and it's an unusual platform. It really emerged from a book that I wrote with James Robison, this book, Indivisible, in 2012. And I'm kind of a Catholic academic, and he is a former crusade evangelist with a TV ministry. And so people might wonder, well, how did these two guys end up together? And it was really providential. But part of our sort of mutually felt mission was to find ways for faithful Christians to work together in the public square. So we built a sort of series of arguments in this book, Indivisible, on economics and culture and politics that we thought was based on things that Catholics and evangelicals share in common. And then after the book came out, we thought, well, what else can we do? And what we came up with is The Stream. It's a website with very specific editorial guidelines, but it's intended to create a platform and maintain a platform where conservative Catholics and evangelicals can think about issues, think about these issues in light of the things we hold in common, really build a platform for action in the public square. So that's at least our mission, and we try to stay faithful to it every day.
Well, I think this appeals to us at Point of View because this is not a foreign concept to those of us who are political conservatives. We have worked with people across the theological board in many traditions to get things done politically. So we're already used to that in a sense. But I think it's good to just point out the reasons for Christian unity, which you're doing now in a series. And I saw the first article in the series. I don't know if you've published any more since then, but the title is "What Real Christians of Every Tradition Share," and we've posted this. So what do they share? Well,
this was the opening piece, and just for listeners, we have had about 12 pieces since then, as you said. One by John Zmirak, who talked about this ecumenism of the trenches, finding each other in front of a Planned Parenthood facility, praying, for instance. But I sort of said, let's step back, because we so often, especially thinking about the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, that's going to sort of surface the things on which we disagree. What are the things we agree on? Well, any faithful Christian is going to agree to the contents of the Apostles' Creed, for instance, all these basic claims about the Trinity and God becoming man and dying for our sins. There's a whole lot of stuff that Catholics and evangelicals hold in common. And the irony, which I pointed out in this piece, is that the incursion of what we call liberal theology starting in the 19th century, which is really a way to kind of import naturalism into Christianity, in which all the terms get redefined, that's in many ways a much more radical difference than the difference that Catholics have with evangelicals and vice versa. In other words, if you're a faithful Presbyterian that says the Apostles' Creed and you believe it, you might have another Presbyterian right next to you in the pew beside you that actually believes in liberal theology and doesn't actually believe in any of that supernatural stuff. My argument is that you've got a lot more space in terms of worldview between you and that person than you as a faithful Presbyterian has with a faithful Catholic. And I think that's something we don't spend a lot of time thinking about.
We don't. And, like Jay, as you said, you're a Catholic. You've got theological liberals in your church. Mm-hmm. And, I know I'm an Anglican, and I have theological liberals in my church, people that were in the Episcopal tradition, and, they stayed as the church moved through its issues in 2006 and 2007. But so I feel like there's a sense in which I really have an opportunity there in my own church to educate people on, what are the biblical, because usually it's the biblical position that's the conservative political position.
No, that's sort of the irony, and that's the other question I ask, is that there's, of course, a difference between liberal theology. In other words, say Rudolf Bultmann, this German theologian that talked about demythologizing the faith, and he would just say crazy things like, he no longer believe in miracles in this age of the radio, or what he called the wireless, which was such a weird statement that somehow because radios and TVs exist that God can't raise people from the dead. But this is kind of the thinking. But it's hard to see, okay, how do you get from that to, well, the government should be in charge of health care? What's this connection between liberal theology and liberal politics? And yet, as you noted, they always seem to travel together, oddly enough. And I think part of this just simply is that, if you have a biblical worldview, if you think God created human beings, if you think there's a human nature so that there are men and women, that's going to dispose you into a particular position when it comes to, say, marriage or the transgender issue. If you believe the fall is real and that everyone is affected by sin, you're going to be much more skeptical of progressivism, which thinks that the government can sort of fix anything and transform people. And so there's a sense in which liberal theology does also sort of push you over onto the left in terms of politics. And that, in fact, I think that one of the main reasons that is because a person who's just sort of deeply bought into liberal theology honestly doesn't believe in a transcendent God. He doesn't believe that Christ is going to return. He doesn't believe in life after death. And as a result, he looks for another source of meaning. There's no God in heaven, so what can be my source of meaning? Well, there's really just kind of one of three popular options. The first one is the self. You just sort of make yourself divine. The second one is the state. You just sort of transfer everything to the power of the government. Or nature. You look at the natural world and worship that thing as divine. I mean, in many ways, I say this is sort of these are the spiritual surrogates that remain if you cease to believe in the transcendent God.
We've already got people calling in, even though I haven't opened up the phones yet. So I think we've got a lot of, opinion and people that want to ask you questions. So let me just give the phone number, 800-351-1212, and we will take your calls, questions, comments for Dr. Jay Richards. I do, when the way you describe liberal theology, I mean, to me, it just sounds like atheism. I'm sort of wondering why do people bother being religious, because they're really atheists.
I mean, it's a very strange thing. I mean, J. Gresham Machen, who was a great Presbyterian scholar, he left Princeton Theological Seminary and he founded Westminster Theological Seminary. He wrote a book way back in 1923 called Liberalism and Christianity, where he just said, look, this just isn't Christianity. C.S. Lewis in the 40s, in his book Miracles, said the same thing. He said the problem with liberal theology is that it leaves out everything that's specifically Christian, the idea that God could break into the created order and could become a human being and be raised from the dead. The whole Christian story is supernatural from beginning to end, and so I think that's right. I think ultimately this isn't Christianity, it's something else, and so it is a perplexing, why do people bother to stay in this? And I think the way I interpret it is that liberal theology is sort of, it's the way station on the way to atheism. So people, maybe basically lose their faith, but they still are attached either to institutions or their family, or maybe they just kind of like the symbolism or something like that. Nobody ever converts to liberal Christianity. Liberal Christians are almost always people that started out as Christians and then they sort of drifted, and then their children usually don't bother to go to church at all, or they actually convert. So in many ways, liberal theology is just kind of Christianity diluted, so that there's a little bit left, and for whatever reason, people don't want to go the whole way with atheism, which to me seems more intellectually honest than redefining what everybody means by all these theological terms.
Yeah, we only have less than a minute, so I'll let you answer after the break. But I look at one part of this, one of the social issues that conservative Christians, conservative political folks like me, we've worked on marriage and we've wanted to keep it as the way God defined it in our laws and in our culture, and we sort of lost that at the courts. But you've got people that are in the church who say that they are homosexuals, that they have these kinds of attractions. And you have two kinds of those. You have those who stay celibate and those who practice. And, part of that, I think, is this evolution that you've talked about into, wanting to hold on to that label of Christianity to sort of give yourself, some kind of affirmation. We'll talk about it after the break. I'll let you kind of give your thoughts on it. We'll be back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. It was September 1956, and Elihu Schimmel was cold and lonely. He was stationed aboard a U.S. naval vessel above the Arctic Circle. His location would account for his being cold, but he didn't think there was much to be done about his loneliness. Rosh Hashanah was set to begin, and aside from another Jewish sailor, Schimmel was several friends short of a minyan, a quorum of 10 Jewish men necessary for services. But Schimmel knew there were others scattered about the fleet in the coldest theater of the Cold War. He decided to ask the powers that be if they would help. The Navy and the Army, hitching a ride, enthusiastically agreed. The order went out that those wishing to join Schimmel aboard ship would be transported by seaplane, launch, or helicopter for the observance of the Jewish high holy days. When the time came, 10 Jewish servicemen showed up, exactly enough. The Navy went further, announcing at sunset that the services were about to begin and ordering all aboard to show reverence by putting out their cigarettes. Schimmel served out his time as a naval medical officer, but he would never forget that celebration high above the Arctic Circle made possible courtesy of the United States military. And we now won't forget how the United States military honored the religious liberty of its service members. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. I'm Penna Dexter, and Jay Richards, PhD, is my guest. He's executive editor of The Stream. We're talking about their series, and I do see that there have been many articles published in the series on Christian unity, but this is the first, sort of the opening article that Dr. Richards wrote, and we are discussing it. It's posted at pointofview.net. But Jay, I talked about the sexual, well, this is really part of the sexual revolution, but the kind of the idea of marriage and how it's been redefined in the culture. The church stood against it, but in the law now, or in the courts, they've said marriage is something different than what God said it is. And I think this sort of shows the power of the sexual revolution, how important it's become to the left.
Absolutely. I mean, in many ways, it's completely overturned entire denominations. I mean, now, with a couple of exceptions, like the United Methodist Church, all of the formerly what we called the mainline denominations, which was really the mainstream of Christianity, say 100 years ago, have all capitulated and surrendered to the LGBT lobby, essentially, and are in the process of redefining these things. Again, you might think, well, if they don't believe in the Christian view of marriage, why don't they go start something else? But in many cases, it's people that sort of raised in a particular church. They like it. Sometimes they want to stay in, and we'll tell you this, they want to stay in order to change the church's views on these things. So rather than going off and starting their own little thing, they want to, in the Episcopal Church, they're essentially infiltrated agents there to transform and to change what that church has always taught. That's happened successfully, unfortunately, in some cases. But I think it shows the stakes that are involved in all these things. I mean, no one 50 years ago would have thought that this liberal theology would actually lead to a denial of the difference between men and women. I mean, this is something that every culture and every time and place has understood. And yet here we are at the beginning of the 21st century in which our culture tells us this, and entire parts of Christianity capitulate to this. The only reason that has happened is because of the incursions of liberal theology ahead of time.
So in a sense, I think your article series is important, and I hope it's widely spread and widely read, because the unity between what you call real Christians, real Christianity, we believe God is real, that's important because, people need to understand what they believe. Sometimes that gets diluted, so people can't articulate their faith well, and so it weakens those of us that believe, biblical truth, but maybe we can't articulate it well. And so I think your articles are really important. I hope that a lot of people are consuming them.
I mean, and that's what we hope to do, because a lot of this stuff, I mean, it's one thing to sort of hear an argument and say, okay, that makes sense to me. It's another to be able to articulate it. And so we spend a lot of time at the stream trying to write things at a very accessible level so that people can actually use these arguments and these discussions, with their family at Thanksgiving. Because I know the homosexuality issue, it's not just dividing the church, it is dividing parents and kids. It is dividing best friends. I mean, I see it on college campuses in which, even good kids that are well educated, maybe they're homeschooled, but they simply don't know what to say when one of their classmates comes out as a homosexual. And I think we've got to know how to respond to these things.
Absolutely. Let's take some calls. Let's go to Bob in Maine. Hi, Bob. Thanks for calling in.
Hi, thank you so much. I agree with that about the subterfuge in the church from the liberal theology crowd. But I think we could unite Catholics and Protestants very strongly against with opposition to the Johnson Act.
The Johnson Amendment?
Yes.
That basically says churches can't endorse candidates?
Correct.
That's right. And in fact, that's an example in which that did happen. I mean, the support that this very unorthodox candidate Donald Trump got, largely from evangelicals, but also a majority of Catholics on Election Day, was in part because as Christians we felt under attack, not just that we were going to have same-sex marriages, but that now Christian florists and bakers had to participate in it. And President Trump, I mean, he didn't have all the details on that, but he did glom on early to this Johnson Amendment, which essentially serves as just to kind of squelch pastors and religious leaders from speaking explicitly about politics. It looks like it's probably going to be done for, and that was one of many examples of just basically perfectly unified interests on political issues that Catholics and evangelicals have.
Yeah, I think that the influence on the Trump administration I think it's been encouraging.
It really has, and I mean, honestly, I felt like, gosh, when he won, I must confess I enjoyed watching Hillary Clinton lose, but I feel like Donald Trump's a bit of a black box, but I think so many Christians befriended Donald Trump and were willing to counsel him that now, I mean, it's really hard not to realize that, gosh, both his judicial appointments and the things he's done so far in religious liberty have just been just about as good as we could have expected.
Bob, do you have another quick comment?
No, but just very quickly that I've seen it in real life that the liberal theologians crowd in our Catholic Church, I mean, they're just, excuse the phrase, hell-bent on women priests and married priests and anything that's counter to present Orthodox teaching.
No, that's exactly right. And I mean, I think what tends to happen in Protestant circles when liberal theology takes over is that the denomination splits, whereas in Catholic circles it tends to be religious orders. And so if you want to see the religious orders that are growing, they are always conservative and Orthodox. If you want to see the ones that are dying or already died, it's always liberal ones. And I mean, liberal theology, I say, it's just like homosexuality. It can't reproduce, and so it has to recruit. And I think that's the bitter reality. And this is whatever church communion you're in, you're going to have to deal with this.
Okay, Bob, thanks for your call. Really, it's good additions to the discussion. Let's go to Hugh in South Carolina, listening in on GNN. Hugh, don't have a whole lot of time before the break, but what's your question?
Well, my comment first is I appreciate Dr. Richard's work and have not followed it exhaustively, but thank you for what you do. And I agree that there are many areas in which all of us in Christendom can cooperate regardless of some of our differences, and we do need to focus on our similarities. One area specifically being in the area of abortion. The Johnson issue being, I agree with that, but in my community, fellow Catholic brother and I have co-coordinated the life chain over a number of years. He's now with the Lord. But there are ways in which we can cooperate and work together. The one issue that I did...
Hey, Hugh, you know what? We don't have time now for the question because I literally have 1 minute before the break. But thanks for that, because you made a very good point about abortion. That's really been a uniter. And the Catholics were actually ahead on that, and the Protestants kind of jumped in later. And we've been able to work together and make a lot of progress, haven't we, Dr. Richards?
Absolutely. And I mean, this is the sort of irony, is that it's the hostility of the surrounding culture more than anything else that's brought us together. And if that's what it takes to help partially fulfill Christ's prayer in John 17, then so be it. But let's make the most of it.
Well, you're a big part of that. Thank you for all the scholarly work that you do and kind of bringing it down to our level so we can all understand it. And thank you for being with me today.
Great to be with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, go to pointofview.net. You can find the article. You can just link. You'll see Jay Richards' picture, and that article's there. Also, the banner allowing you to donate to the Cradle Fund to help out the folks displaced, actually going back now, that were affected by ISIS taking over really the Christian cradle of civilization. We can help folks not only spiritually, psychologically, but also materially. So join us in doing that. Go to pointofview.net. You'll see that banner on the bottom. Well, we've got a lot more. We are barely scratching the surface here at Point of View, so stay with us. We'll be back.
Down the road, and just ahead, you see an elderly woman tumble off the curb into the street. As your friend drives past, she prays, "Lord, please send someone to help that poor woman," and drives on. What if that was your mother or grandmother? In Christ, our family includes people like Sarah. Sarah was 95 years old, and she didn't tumble into a street. She was forced into it because ISIS was coming. Countless Christians like Sarah are suffering in the Middle East, the birthplace, the cradle of Christianity, and we refuse to pass on by. We urge you to stop with us for just a moment and lend a helping hand to persecuted Christians through the Cradle Fund. Visit pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Our Middle Eastern family needs us. Stop and give right now. Pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or mail a check with Cradle Fund in the memo to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Penna Dexter.
Thank you very much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen, for the second hour of Point of View. A couple of weeks ago, I was, on a weekend, I was sitting in my local Starbucks, which I often do, and take the Wall Street Journal with me. And I was kind of blown away by this opinion. It is entitled, The Politicization of Motherhood. And we posted it at pointofview.net. Beautiful picture of an author of a new book out. And the new book is called Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters. Well, it just kind of, that kind of topic resonates with my heart. And when I hear that it's politicized, it doesn't surprise me, and I know it is. But my guest wrote this book. Her name is Erica Komisar. I think I'm pronouncing that right. She's a psychoanalyst. She lives and practices on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which I was in New York last week, so I know where she's from. And she's practiced there for many years. She's got a great pedigree, and she's a graduate of Georgetown and Columbia Universities and the New York Freudian Society. She's a psychological consultant. She deals in parenting and work-life issues. Erica, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
The reason your book has been politicized is because even though it's got a great amount of research in it, underlying your thesis here, people on the left, especially the women on the morning television shows, they don't want to hear that it's important for them to be there the first 3 years of their child's life, do they?
I think it's a hard message to tell all women today. Again, the book is often misinterpreted in terms of being a book about staying home or working, when it's really a book about prioritizing. And prioritizing means more is more. The more emotionally and physically present we can be in the first 3 years for what we call the critical period of brain development, the better off our children will be. And it is a hard message, and it makes many women feel guilty and defensive. Yeah.
Well, you talked about the prioritizing, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but give us a little bit of the science and how you came to, I know you came to this conclusion over many years of practice, didn't you?
Yeah, I've been in practice for almost 30 years doing parent guidance. And, I was seeing a devaluing of mothering in society, and really an epidemic level of emotionally troubled children in my practice that were being diagnosed at an earlier and earlier age and medicated at an earlier age for symptoms that seemed connected to the absence of mothers in their lives on a daily basis, meaning when I treated those families by getting the mothers to be more present, what I found is really palpable, really tangible changes in those symptoms. And I started looking at the research, and I looked at over a 12-year period, looked at all of the neuroscience and attachment and epigenetics research that was available, and there's a huge body of evidence that really says that mothers are not just emotionally important to children in the first 3 years, but are critical from a biological level in terms of their right brain or social emotional brain. And so, yeah, it's biological, not just emotional.
Well, you're a mother, you said, and you actually have a very important career. I don't know if you ever took time off to just full-time mother during the first 3 years, but you certainly managed to raise your children and also make a great impact in the society.
So I did get to I was fortunate enough, and I say fortunate because not all mothers are fortunate enough, meaning we don't have policies either in the private sector for the most part or in government to really encourage mothers and babies to be together in the first year to 3 years. But I was fortunate to be able to take off 8 months with each child. I have 3 children, and then to go back part-time and have control over my schedule. But that was something that I had planned out 10 years in advance of having children. So one of the reasons to write this book has really been to think preventatively about this issue, from a government standpoint, from a private sector standpoint, but also from an individual woman standpoint, to really think out what is it you need to give to your children in those years, and what do I need to sacrifice or accommodate, or how can I make it work in those early years? Because we're really just talking about the first 3 years. And if we say life is long, you can do everything in life. You just can't do it all at the same time.
Absolutely. That's so true. Talk, first of all, because you get these arguments, and then if you present the science, sometimes you can actually stop the argument if the person will be honest and will listen. So tell us about the hormonal scientific basis of what you're saying.
So we know that mothers do a number of things for children in terms of growing the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, which is the social emotional part of the brain. They buffer children from stress in the first 3 years. We understand now that children are born much more neurologically fragile than we ever have known before, meaning mothers in the first 9 months are actually the central nervous system for the baby. And they buffer the baby from stress, and after 3 years, that's internalized by the baby as resilience to stress, meaning they feel emotionally secure enough to deal with what may come in life. And in terms of emotional regulation, from moment to moment, mothers do this other very important thing, which is every time a mother comforts a baby in distress, she's actually regulating the baby's emotions so they don't go too high or too low, and is bringing the baby back to what we call homeostasis. And again, babies aren't born with the ability to regulate their emotions. They learn it in that 3-year period from the moment-to-moment interaction with their mother. At the end of that 3-year period, the baby then internalizes the ability to regulate their own emotions. And there's so much more research. There's oxytocin research, which basically says that, mothers produce something called oxytocin in their brains. It's like a love hormone. And the more they nurture, the more they touch their babies, the more they have skin-to-skin contact, the more they make eye contact with their babies, the more they talk to their babies, the more oxytocin is produced in their brain, and the more oxytocin is produced in the baby's brain. And what we understand is that oxytocin has an inverse relationship with cortisol, which is the stress hormone. The more oxytocin in our brains, the lower the stress in our bodies and brains. So it's very important. It's a very important critical period of brain development, this first 3 years.
This is so fascinating. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm opening up the phones. Actually, they're open, but I'd like to encourage you, if you have a question or a comment for Erica Komisar, she is my guest. 800-351-1212 is the number. We just got a few seconds before the break, but it was very interesting. Well, I love this because it was kind of my goal to be home with my children. And so I, like you, I planned it. And my husband has a business, and he's got employees that he loves. And when they get pregnant and have babies, he just makes it easy for them to be able to be flexible because he wants them to work for him. And I just think those are just a couple of solutions. I mean, there are solutions. We're smart people and we can figure out how to do it. No, you can't do everything all at one time, and there are sacrifices to be made in life. But mothers, that's a huge role in life. It's an important role. And so, maybe you can't be the mother you want to be full time, and maybe you can't be the professional person you want to be full time, but you can do both in certain ways. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. We'll do it more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, religious liberty is one of the foundations of America, and it is a right enshrined in the First Amendment. But Mary Eberstadt is concerned about the widespread discrimination in today's secular society. She explains why in her book it's dangerous to believe religious freedom in its enemies. Her book begins with the many stories that I have presented in various commentaries and that we often discuss on radio each week with Kelly Shackelford of First Liberty. Then she goes on to explain how Christians can respond to critics by holding them to standards they supposedly accept. Two examples show why Christians need to be concerned about this trend and need to learn how to respond. First, there is the sad story of Mozilla CEO Brendan Eich, who was hounded out of his position merely because he supported Proposition 8 in 2008 in California. Mary Eberstadt made the point that if someone this important and powerful could be forced out of a business, what chance do the rest of us have? The second example is Michael Lindsay, president of Gordon College in Massachusetts. He and 14 other Christians signed a letter asking for a religious exemption to the president's planned executive order banning sexual orientation discrimination by federal contractors. It's worth mentioning that even Senator Elizabeth Warren supported a religious exemption in such cases. The city of Salem suspended a long-term contract with Gordon. The Lynn School Committee ended its relationship with the college and refused to accept Gordon College students as student teachers. Then the New England Association of Schools and Colleges announced that it was going to consider whether the college violated their standards for accreditation. It is easy to see the irony. 3 centuries after the original Salem witch trials, Gordon College was subjected to a secularist witch trial. This is why Christians need to understand what is happening and take a bold stand for religious liberty. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kirby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. My guest is Erica Komisar. Her book is Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters. And Erica, I think the way you title the book is so good because you are talking about prioritizing. It almost sounds harsh for me to say, figure out a way to do it because, economic priorities sometimes trump some of these things that we feel we should be doing, and women get torn, and it's very difficult. But the word prioritizing can go across the spectrum of what you do, and so it's kind of like where do you put the importance of raising your child in your mind? You'll do things that will follow that.
We really don't want to lose that feeling too. You mentioned something really important. We don't want to lose the feeling of being torn. We want to be able to feel empathic towards our children's feelings, and there is a loss for our children when we leave them when they're very vulnerable. And so that empathy that we have for them helps us to repair when we have to work and we come back. It's that empathy. There's a whole chapter in the book on how to repair the separation. And you need to do that whether you've been gone for 5 minutes to go to the bathroom or whether you've been gone for 6 hours or 8 hours to go to work. So, the idea that we shouldn't feel that our babies are in pain is a strange idea for me because it's only if we understand they've been in pain that we can empathize with them and actually help repair what's happened in our absence.
So, Erica, I heard sort of a podcast, a couple of young conservative women broadcasters were talking about your book, and even they were they saw the science and they understood that. But they just said you can't let this interrupt your career was kind of their point. That was one of the points, which I thought wow, that's sad. But the other part of it was you can't always run to your baby when they're upset. You sometimes have to let them just cry it out. You're not saying that you should never let them cry something out or put them down and try to let them sleep, are you?
From the very beginning, babies have little bits of separation, meaning we're always separate. The moment our baby is born, they're separate from our body. And they still need to have skin-to-skin contact. They need to hear our heartbeat. They need to, remember, they've been in your body, literally in your body for 9 months. So when they come out, they still need to be on your body. But eventually they need to feel little bits of separation, and they have that when they feel frustration. The idea is that we want to introduce frustration developmentally, meaning incrementally as a child can bear the frustration. So it requires a kind of sensitivity on the part of the mother to know how much frustration that individual child can bear. For instance, a very sensitive child, there's a lot in the book about what we call sensitive children, which are being now identified as it being more genetic than anything. When babies are born and they're more colicky, or they're more sensitive to the environment, or they cry more easily, or they're more demanding, they're what we call sensitive babies. And many of them, we know now, are born with something called a short allele on the serotonin receptor. What the research shows is when a mother provides sensitive, empathic nurturing, it neutralizes the expression of that gene. Those children have as good a chance as other children to be emotionally healthy. But little bits and increments of frustration have to be introduced to babies from the beginning. That doesn't mean crying it out, though. So, it may mean being sensitive to when the baby's cries go from frustration and a little bit of anger to despair. So I try to teach mothers about the difference in those cries. But for many mothers, it's instinctual to know when their baby is crying out of despair versus out of frustration.
Yeah, I've got some grandchildren that are little, and I've noticed my daughters-in-law and daughter being able to discern those cries, because they want their children to be able to put them, lay in the bed and go to sleep. And there's some rebellious cries there as they get a little bit older. But, to know when it's really, really that cry where they really need you to go back in is important.
Right. So we understand that distress or despair causes the baby to produce a lot of stress hormones in their brain. And we know that that's not good for babies in the long run, both in terms of physically and emotionally. So, and babies that are under extreme stress for very long periods of time, there's even research going on now to show that it's a little bit like a light switch that's turned on that gets stuck and can't be turned off, And so stress hormones can be turned on. Basically, the limbic system gets turned on, which is the alarm system of the brain. And then it can't be turned off. And then we're seeing things like ADHD or early signs of aggression in children, which are really signs of fight or flight. They're stress-related symptoms. We actually are meant to soothe and comfort our babies when they're in distress. But that's different than a frustration cry.
Wow. Okay, we got lots of people that want to ask you questions.
Yeah,
let's go to Brooklyn, Texas.
Yeah.
And is it Brooklyn?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Okay.
It's Brooklyn in Texas. It's not Brooklyn, Texas.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was wondering if you've had a long period of separation from a baby within that 3-year period, are you able to make it up with them if you spend time with them, or is it like the window's closed and the damage is done?
So the good news is that the brain is plastic within that period of critical brain development and also after it. So our brains are always growing and shrinking according to our environment. And there's actually another critical period of brain development when you have the ability to make a great influence on the brain, which is adolescence. And now we know adolescence is 9 to 29. And actually that's the book I'm working on now, which is the second period of critical brain development. But what I'll say to you is it's never too late. You always have a chance to repair. First, you have to acknowledge that something has happened that's caused your baby pain or your child pain, and then you have the ability to try to repair it.
Wow, fascinating. Okay. Thank you so much, Brooklyn, for your call. We've got a few that we want to get to, and not as much time as I'd like. Let's go to...
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brooklyn.
You're welcome.
Let's go to Jan in Georgia, listening on GNN. Hi, Jan. Thanks for calling in.
Hi, I certainly want to get this book.
Yeah.
Listen, I was wondering, what is the long-term effect on, say, whatever neglected child emotionally for those years, or what is the long-term effect on the adult?
Mm-hmm. There are many studies to show. The biggest study was out of Kaiser Permanente, and it was a longitudinal study, so a very long-term study of studying people over their lifetime. And what we understand is that early childhood trauma or neglect causes things like depression and anxiety and addiction in the long run. Can, not always. So it may cause those things. And again, we understand that attachment disorders are related to those symptoms. So if a child has been neglected, they often develop what we call an attachment disorder, which can turn into something like anxiety and depression.
All right. Well, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Let's take another quick call. You know, Erica, I hear you're writing another book, and that's so great. I would love to have you for a full hour sometime, because this has really struck a chord. People have a lot of specific questions for you, and I don't even think that we've really unpacked this whole idea either of how to, just how the society could work to make this happen.
Right.
And really how
happy to
huge
come
it
back.
is.
Yeah. I would be happy to come back and talk more about it, because obviously I'm very passionate about this subject.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I'm glad you are. And I'm glad you're skilled and talented to be able to kind of bring us into the fold here. Let's take one more very quick call. Okay. Roseanne in Texas. Roseanne, real quick.
Yeah. Well, my question was something like Brooklyn's. My daughter was born prematurely, and she was whisked away to the hospital. I was put in another hospital, and she spent the first 2 weeks without any contact with me, other than just, the doctors were, with how they handle the babies and the nurses, and they drew blood. It was kind of rough beginning for her. And I was just wondering, is she ever going to recover? Because she seems to have these emotional problems that.
And also, what could Roseanne do?
Right.
As a mom.
How old is your daughter now?
She's 19.
She's 19.
Yeah.
So the research shows that actually being in talk therapy, not cognitive behavioral therapy, but talk therapy that is what we call reflective therapy, empathic reflective talk therapy, can actually help the parts of the brain that have been impacted by attachment issues and trauma. It can actually help those parts of the brain to regenerate.
I got to leave it there.
So,
that's a great piece of advice.
Okay.
This is why I need to have you back, because this has been great.
I'll
Erica, thank you so much for your joining us today. Roseanne, sorry I had to cut it short, but that was a good question and a good answer. Ladies and gentlemen, next up we're going to talk about God and Donald Trump. Steve Strang will join us. Stay with us.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the fully animated story of the first Christmas told through a whole new set of eyes. Bo the donkey and his stable of animal friends follow the star to become some unlikely heroes.
That light, that's the star. This is where it's been leading me. What's his name?
His name is Jesus.
The Star, in theaters November 17th. More information is available at thestarmovie.com.
If you are homeless and on the run, all because you love Jesus, would you want Christians to step up and help? Our family in the Middle East, the cradle of our faith, is in desperate need because of ISIS and other persecutors. Point of View urges you to support the Cradle Fund today to help these precious believers. Please give at pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or write Cradle Fund in the memo of your check to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Penna Dexter.
Welcome back to Point of View. It's the 9th of November, and I don't know if a lot of you realize this, but it's actually 1 year ago today that we first realized that we were going to have Donald Trump as the president of the United States. And I think the year's gone kind of fast. I don't know about you, but I feel like the listeners to Point of View and I and Kirby Anderson and a lot of us here, we've kind of been through something together, the whole campaign and then this first year. And another person who I feel really went through this and has chronicled what happened is my next guest, and his name is Steve Strang. He wrote a book called God and Donald Trump, which we're going to discuss. But a lot of you know who Steve Strang is because he's an award-winning journalist, and he's also the CEO of Charisma Media and founder of Charisma Magazine. Steve, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's a privilege. Well, I remember that date 1 year ago today. I was actually in New York, as I am today, at the Hilton at the election party. And you're right, it was the early hours. It was 2:45 our time when he came out, to accept the will of the people and to address them as their president-elect. So that was an exciting night. And I came up here because I believed that he had a chance to win, and I wanted to be a part of history. So when I came on my book tour in New York, I wanted to stay at the New York Hilton, which was where the party was. It just seemed appropriate to me.
Well, I feel I'm really actually flattered and grateful that you were able to join us today on this sort of 1 year anniversary, because I do think that it's important to go back and look at how this happened. And I don't know that we believers could still explain what happened. A lot of this was supernatural. But, very few evangelicals supported Donald Trump in the beginning. And I think your book is about sort of how people came to support him. How this man won the enthusiastic support by the end of evangelicals. And just the evangelical support is really what took him over the top, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And you said it in passing, what the real reason is. It is supernatural. Of course, secular people or non-religious people don't get it. They don't even understand that. But Hillary Clinton doesn't seem to get it either. And, of course, you wrote a book called What Happened? And I like to say that my book answers the question, and the answer is that God intervened because many conservative, evangelical, Bible-believing Christians and just a lot of concerned Americans were very, very concerned that our nation was heading in a direction that it shouldn't be going in. It's been going to the left and becoming more and more immoral for, many decades, but it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. And so we called out, we prayed, God, raise up somebody. And God answered our prayers in a way we didn't expect with a person who we didn't even necessarily like. Yet I believe that he has been raised up for such a time as this, to quote the scripture from Esther. And I feel that he has really come through with some of his promises to the Christian community a lot better than other presidents have who were known to be evangelical Christians, primarily George W. Bush and Jimmy Carter. Yeah, and I think he is doing, a great job considering what he's fighting.
Well, Steve, you talked about the erosion of the culture, and that was what concerned so many Christians, so much so that people got together, tried to form, ways of getting behind a candidate so that their Christians weren't divided. The erosion of the culture was the main concern there. And it was interesting because Donald Trump didn't,
right.
But he didn't say that he was going to fix that. And yet somehow the Christians, the evangelicals, Catholics, all kinds of people came to support him because they somehow saw that he would be the solution to that, even though he didn't specifically make a lot of the promises, really, did he?
You're right. But part of it also was the alternative because Hillary Clinton represents a type of corruption that we've never seen in this country. And, it was bad under Obama. we believe it would have gotten a lot worse under Hillary. But, I didn't support Donald Trump initially. I mean, I knew him through the media. I knew him as a New York billionaire who had a reality TV show. I wasn't drawn to him at all. I was a Ted Cruz supporter. But as time passed and as Ted Cruz's campaign kind of faltered, I saw that God was raising up Donald Trump, and some people who I respected had backed him. And, I don't know where your listeners are on the theological spectrum, but kind of the evangelicals who you would consider that everybody would know their name, they did not largely back Donald Trump. It was really charismatics affiliated with Paula White who came around him initially. Now, Paula is a lady preacher with a TV show, and Donald Trump watched her on TV as he watches other Christian TV shows for a number of years. And about 10 years ago, he called her office one day, told her he watched the show. She was shocked to find that out, and he invited her to Trump Tower. And a friendship ensued over a period of years. So when Donald Trump was thinking about running in 2012, he called Paula and he said, Paula, I need you to call some of your friends, some of your preacher friends together who know how to pray. He said, I'm not going to ask them for their support. I'm going to ask them to pray. So they got together, met with them, prayed, and, of course, he decided not to run. And in 2016, of course, he reached out to Paula again. So very, very early in the campaign, some of these people would get together and pray with him, and after their meeting, they would gather around him and lay hands on him, and somebody would always take a movie of this on their iPhone, and it would show up on YouTube, and I saw them, and I saw people like Kenneth Copeland and Paula White and others praying for him and laying hands on him. Robert Jeffers, the pastor of the great church in Dallas, First Baptist Church, was also an early supporter, and he was in some of those videos. But when I saw that, I thought, this is very interesting. I've been in lots of settings with evangelical leaders, with politicians, including a couple of presidents, mainly when they're currying our vote, and a prayer was never even said, let alone gathering around and laying hands on them like Christians do. But Trump seemed to enjoy it, and it happened not once but many times. And so I think that he appreciated the support. He appreciated the prayer support. And I think that over time, he is kind of evolving more and more in our direction. He's definitely changed from what he was 20 or 30 years ago. In fact, Paula
this is the influence of Christians, Steve. Okay, here we are in a week when people are criticizing believers for praying for victims of the shooting in the church in Texas, in Sutherland Springs, Texas. And then they're publicly critiquing government officials for praying because they don't understand the definition of prayer and what prayer really is. And so, I think, all the Christian leaders who weren't Trump supporters, but they were praying for God's person. And sometimes prayer is not asking for something. It's finding out what God wants. It's finding out God's heart on something. And in this case, this is the way I felt about it as I evolved, because I was really, up until he secured the nomination, I was a Cruz person, and I was anti-Trump, but God did something to my heart along the way as I started to see it. And I do think that prayer changes us, and God, he has a plan, and we Christians can either cooperate or not. What do you think?
You're absolutely right. And something shifted just about a month before you're talking about, before the convention. There was a meeting in New York City with about 1,000 pastors. Now, I'm not a pastor. I was invited, but I had a pretty important appointment. And I thought, well, I already support Trump. I don't need to go to that meeting. Plus, I wanted my own interview, which I was able to get a one-on-one interview with him a little later. And of course, this is all in the book. But at that meeting, that was a tipping point, because all the really top people from James Dobson on down were there. They asked him questions, and Trump won them over. And the book goes into some of the conversations they had and what he said. And he is against abortion. He values the same kinds of things that we value. And also, he's the first politician I've ever heard of who's even talked about the Johnson Amendment, which is the IRS rule that says that nonprofits and churches can have their nonprofit status removed if they get involved in politics. And this has been a real muzzle on the church.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting story, which is
let
also
me
in
jump in because we've got to take a break here. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Strang is with me, and we're talking about the Trump election, and we'll also talk a little bit about this first year of Donald Trump. What has been God's influence? Sometimes God influences the nations through unlikely leaders. And we'll also take your calls, 800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. It was September 1956, and Elihu Schimmel was cold and lonely. He was stationed aboard a U.S. naval vessel above the Arctic Circle. His location would account for his being cold, but he didn't think there was much to be done about his loneliness. Rosh Hashanah was set to begin, and aside from another Jewish sailor, Schimmel was several friends short of a minyan, a quorum of 10 Jewish men necessary for services. But Schimmel knew there were others scattered about the fleet in the coldest theater of the Cold War. He decided to ask the powers that be if they would help. The Navy and the Army, hitching a ride, enthusiastically agreed. The order went out that those wishing to join Schimmel aboard ship would be transported by seaplane, launch, or helicopter for the observance of the Jewish high holy days. When the time came, 10 Jewish servicemen showed up, exactly enough. The Navy went further, announcing at sunset that the services were about to begin and ordering all aboard to show reverence by putting out their cigarettes. Schimmel served out his time as a naval medical officer, but he would never forget that celebration high above the Arctic Circle made possible courtesy of the United States military. And we now won't forget how the United States military honored the religious liberty of its service members. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
My name is Penna Dexter, and on the line with me is Steve Strang, and he is CEO of Charisma Media and founder of Charisma Magazine. His new book, God and Donald Trump, is actually a fascinating read, and you can find out more by going to pointofview.net. You'll see a picture of Steve and also the book. And I recommend it. Actually, I've been having fun reading it, Steve. Do you think President Trump thinks he was put here by God for a special purpose now after a year?
I really
watching
do.
him?
Yes, I do. Based on what people have told me, that he senses some kind of destiny. In this last 10 years that I referred to earlier, he's felt like maybe there was some kind of destiny on his life. And he's shown remarkable humility several times when he's met with Christian leaders, which is documented in the book, and he would say things like, while I was off making money, you were pursuing a higher calling. You know, to consider that being a member of the clergy is a higher calling than being a billionaire. And there are things like that that have happened. And, you know, he's not the first leader who's had a sense of destiny. If you read about Abraham Lincoln or certainly Winston Churchill, he had a sense of destiny since the time he was a teenager, that God would some kind of use him. And we do believe that he is the one who kind of saved England. But he was somebody who the Christian leaders of his day did not particularly like. You know, he smoked cigars and drank brandy, and, you know, we could go on. But yet God was able to use him, as God used imperfect people in the Old Testament as well. And God uses, all of us are imperfect, and hopefully God can use us. But getting back to your questions, I do believe that he has kind of a sense of destiny.
So, you know, I mean, I think I did not really realize how much sentiment there was across the nation of sort of discontent, of feeling we were losing the country. I mean, in many areas I felt that myself, but I didn't realize the depth of that. And I think when I started realizing that, and I started seeing that it couldn't be politics as usual that would be the change, that's kind of, you know, that's when my heart was also changing toward supporting him. And so, you know, I don't know about you, but that's just kind of how I felt.
I agree with you entirely. And Donald Trump has some kind of gift to be able to tap into that, you know, to make America great. And getting Christian values more prominent in our culture and winning some of these cultural wars, I believe personally, is part of making America great. But, you know, even what he's doing over in Asia right now with the meeting with all these leaders and trying to do something about the trade imbalances and trying to do something about, you know, the dictator in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, who is so dangerous. I mean, all of those things are also making America great. And I think that a lot of people responded to that. Now, we're a deeply divided country, but there are a lot of people who don't like God. I mean, you were just talking about how they criticize prayer. I mean, they just criticize anything. They probably would criticize us for going to church on Sunday. You know, just any, you know, we had the audacity to believe the Bible, this old ancient book that's full of myths, they say. Mm-hmm. They just don't get it. And, you know, like I referred to earlier, this has been going on for a long time, but it's kind of like it's coming to a head. And when Donald Trump talks about draining the swamp, that was kind of a good word picture to understand what's going on in Washington. But it is a lot more than just our government. I mean, it's deep, deep, deep in our culture. And Donald Trump is getting all these people sort of off balance, unsettled. They don't like him. They attack him. And really all it is all this vitriol, I believe, against the people of God and anything that we stand for. And I'm just thankful that Donald Trump is so tough. I don't know anybody else who could be so tough to stand up to this horrific criticism and pressure that's being put on him.
Yeah. You speak in your book of a growing Christian resistance movement. And, you know, like there are traditional social issues that I think that the Christians of all sort of traditions and denominations have been able to coalesce and work on, like the sanctity of human life. Of course, we fought on the marriage issue and we fight for religious liberty. We try to protect that. Some of those are more traditional issues, but you've sort of touched on it. There's more than that. There are deeper issues. There's the draining of the swamp. There's the whole globalist agenda that this program has talked about for 20 years. And, you know, he pulled us out of for instance, the Paris Climate Accord, which right now there's a climate conference taking place in Bonn, Germany. He is just being vilified, even by American representatives there, because he dared to pull us out of that. And so, you know, he's kind of fearless, and I do pray for him because you'd have to have a very thick skin to be him, don't you?
I agree with you, and it's just amazing to see what he's done in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, what about the Congress, though, and, you know, the failures, in a sense, for the Congress and President Trump to work together to do some of the things that were promised? I mean, what's your take on all of that?
Well, my book goes into the fact that it's not necessarily Democrat and Republican versus Republican or even left versus right. It's really nationalism, American nationalism versus globalism. And even presidents that I respected, like the two George Bushes, both, if you really get down to it, were globalists. And, you know, kind of the elites in our culture all think that, you know, this is kind of moving toward a one world government, which if you study prophecy at all really would give us pause for concern as Christians. And I'm just glad to see that Donald Trump is standing up to it and trying to put an end to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun, if you know, just to observe it if you didn't have a stake in it like we do, and I feel like the listeners to this program feel like they have a real stake in the future of the country, but you just look back from a bird's eye view to look at this unlikely president. It's just so interesting to watch, but God sometimes works in counterintuitive ways, doesn't he?
He really does. And let me just mention something else that I go into the book that I think is unique of all the books written about Trump, and that is that there were several prophecies that Trump would be president, and these prophecies were against all odds because, of course, nobody thought that. And I just felt it was important to put that on the record to kind of tell the untold story. There are a lot of people who don't, I mean, prophecy is not real common, and, you know, some prophecies are wrong, but these prophecies were right. And I just believe that God, you know, showed this to these prophets. And for me personally, because I knew some of them and knew that they had been right in the past. In fact, Chuck Pierce, who is the first one that I document, he told my wife and me in 2008 over dinner when he was in our hometown that Barack Obama would be elected twice. And, of course, we were not happy to hear that at all. This was before even the nomination.
Wow.
But, of course, that became true. So when he said that Trump was going to be elected, of course, it had more credibility as far as I was concerned. And, of course, that did happen.
Well, it's an amazing story. I'm glad that you told it in this book. Steve, you're a person who, you know, you've been in this publishing field. You've ministered to Christians through your work. And I'm so glad that you are in the know and in the thick of the culture wars and politics too, because I think that's where, you know, God works in those fields. We're not to stay away from them, and yet, you know, our loyalties are elsewhere. But thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for the book, and you know, I really enjoy my copy. I'm going to continue to. I've worked my way through most of it, but I'm going to finish it up tonight.
Well, good. I really appreciate that, and thank you for having me on your show.
That is Steve Strang, and really, he's been a warrior in the Christian trenches for many years, and this book is another one of his products, so I recommend it. I hope you'll get it. You can find out more by going to pointofview.net, and tomorrow is our weekend edition. Kirby will be back in the hot seat, and we hope you'll join us then. Also, please go to pointofview.net. Look at our banner about the Cradle Fund, and join us. Have a great evening.
You're riding down the road, and just ahead you see an elderly woman tumble off the curb into the street. As your friend drives past, she prays, "Lord, please send someone to help that poor woman," and drives on. What if that was your mother or grandmother? In Christ, our family includes people like Sarah. Sarah was 95 years old, and she didn't tumble into a street. She was forced into it because ISIS was coming. Countless Christians like Sarah are suffering in the Middle East, the birthplace, the cradle of Christianity, and we refuse to pass on by. We urge you to stop with us for just a moment and lend a helping hand to persecuted Christians through the Cradle Fund. Visit pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Our Middle Eastern family needs us. Stop and give right now. pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or mail a check with Cradle Fund in the memo to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so